So the brain, quite a complicated place. There are quite a lot of different parts, and it's really important that you keep referring to the syllabus to find out what parts you specifically need to know about and in relation to what, because there's quite a lot to know, and if it's on the syllabus, it is fair game for your external. You've quite likely gone over a bit of this in class already, so we're going to skip over this a little bit for now, but there is just a few parts I will quickly draw your attention to. And the first one is actually the cerebrum, which is this big outer part of the brain that kind of like looks like folded sausages. It's also important that you don't confuse that with the cerebellum, which is kind of like that little mini brain down the bottom that's involved in like movement and balance and coordination and like coordinating smooth movements and all of that. But for the moment, I want us to focus on the cerebellum. Oh, sorry, even I just got it confused. The cerebrum, which is that big outermost layer, thicker region on the top that again looks like those like folded sausages. So the cerebral cortex, so we're getting more specific now, is the outermost layer of the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is all of the sausagey kind of looking bit at the top, and then the cerebral cortex is the outermost top layer of that. It's a folded structure, like I've said before. The mountains are like the gyrus, so like the upper bits of the fold, and then like the valleys are known as like sulci, or they can also be referred to as like grooves and fissures. So we have the top bit, which is the cerebrum, and then we have the very top layer of that, which is the cerebral cortex, which is also kind of divided into two halves, which is our cerebral hemispheres, which you might be familiar as well. And they're also separated by the longitudinal fissure, which runs down the middle. So we have our left hemisphere and our right hemisphere as well. I'm not sure if that came up the right way on the camera or if I did that the right way, but we do have a left and a right hemisphere. So each hemisphere also has 4 lobes, which are mirrored on each hemisphere. So we're going to be looking at those in a second. There's also some other important parts of the brain that aren't on this diagram, such as like the basal ganglia, the primary motor cortex, and we do have the cerebellum on here. Those 3 you learn about, especially in relation to voluntary movement. And then the limbic system and prefrontal cortex you'll probably learn about in relation to emotion. So keep in mind there's a whole bunch of different parts of the brain that we need to be aware of. So as I mentioned before, there are those 4 different lobes, like that outermost layer of the cerebrum is the cerebral cortex. So we have the left and the right, and then that's broken up into these 4 different lobes. One thing that I think is really important is actually being able to label and remember where each are. So some of the tips that I have for how to remember that is, first of all, the frontal lobe. I find that fairly easy to remember because I know it's the frontal lobe. And then the other one that I find a little easy to remember is the occipital lobe. I remember that that's right up the back of the brain. How I remember that is because once you learn a little bit more about visual perception as well, that'll get a little bit easier because your eyes actually receive the sensory, like the stimuli from everything around you that you're seeing, and then they actually send that to the back of the brain for processing in the occipital lobe. So I find it fairly easy to remember frontal lobes at the front and occipital lobe is at the back. But then sometimes it can be a little bit confusing as to how to remember where parietal and temporal lobes go. I kind of have a few little ways to remember it. One of the ways, it seems a little bit silly, but one of the ways that I like to remember it is I think about like a parent, like patting a child on the head. So I think like parietal lobe, like parental, like a parent patting their child on the head. Or you might think like temporal lobe is down a bit lower, so maybe it's near your ears because temporal is to do with like your sound and hearing. And then the last little trick that I have is I just think of like the letters PT, like a personal trainer. I think like P on the top and then T down below. So parietal lobe, temporal lobe. So that's kind of another little way that I remember it as well. Maybe one of those ways will make sense to you, maybe not. Whatever little way you can come up to remember those with will be really helpful to kind of, get it all straight in your head as to which one is where. So what do each of these areas actually do? So first up, the frontal lobe. That's like the bigger area. It's the one up the front. It's responsible for quite a lot of different things. It's responsible for like speech and language, abstract thought, movement, planning, judgment, problem solving, aspects of personality and emotion, and social skills. It's mostly like that higher order functions and like higher order thinking. But remember and keep in mind that the brain is very complicated. Quite a lot of the things that we try and like simplify, like memory occurs here, or emotion is controlled by this. We've actually simplified quite a lot of it. So a lot of it happens with coordination and connection with a lot of different brain areas, because the brain is a very complicated place and we're only kind of exploring the beginning of it here. Like I said before, occipital lobes are responsible for visual perception. How I remember that, it's like occipital, like I think eye, or like optometrist. It's kind of like those same kind of like word parts. Occipital, like referring to the eye. Parietal lobes are responsible for spatial awareness and sense of touch. So for example, like pain, temperature. How I remember that is like spatial. The second letter is P, so parietal spatial. It's not the perfect little cue, but it does help me remember it. And then also like sense of touch, pain, like parietal pain. So that's another way to remember that it's responsible for touch. And then the last one is temporal lobes, which are responsible for auditory processing. So listening to sounds and words, recognizing them, comprehending speech, and all of that. So I think temporal, like tempo, like music, sound, auditory. So that's how I kind of link those in my head as well.